The Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Institute, and pleasure is not quite the right word given the topic, but I am proud today to have you join us both in person and online for the launch of the new book, Hard Target, Sanctions, Inducements in the Case of North Korea by Stephan Haggard and Marcus Noland. As many of you know, Steph Haggard, who is Krauss Distinguished Professor of Korea-Pacific Studies at the Graduate School of UC San Diego, and Marcus Noland, our Executive Vice President and Director of Studies, have been doing pretty much unique, and in this case I actually do mean the word unique, research and insight into the North Korean situation along a number of dimensions for several years. And for many years, the Peterson Institute has done more work on the Korean economy than any other institution that doesn't have Korea in its name or Korea government on its board. This, of course, includes Mark Noland's award-winning book, Avoiding the Apocalypse, The Futures of the Two Koreas, includes a number of studies by Jeffrey Schott and co-authors on trade issues involving South Korea and the rest of the world, including, of course, Chorus. But the ongoing work by Mark, by Steph Haggard, and by a series of very good young research analysts who've come through and gone on to greater things has been truly unique. And this book, which is, in a sense, the third that they have come out with after Witness to Transformation, Refugee Insights to North Korea, and Famine in North Korea, Markets, Aid, and Reform, both published a few years ago. This book, Hard Target, is actually not only unique, it is both fresh and relevant. Fresh in that Mark and Steph have taken an insight from political science and made it operationally, empirically relevant in a way that extends and usefully builds on the great work by Huffbauer, Schott, Elliott, and others that we've sponsored through the years on sanctions. Mark will go into more detail, of course, but the key aspect is to think about not just who you're targeting, but in a sense, the hardness of the target. What is the authoritarian regime? Given it's an authoritarian regime, how are they likely to respond to inducements and threats? And so this is a whole new dimension of ways of thinking about the effectiveness of sanctions. Additionally, it is, to say perhaps the obvious, but bears stating, it is immensely topical and important today. We all are seeing the frustration that the Trump administration is finding in their dealings with North Korea as progress continues to be made on the missiles capabilities within North Korea and various other aspects of that authoritarian regime's outwardly hostile behavior to South Korea, to Japan, to the US, and to the world. Usually one sees frustration in the Trump administration and sort of goes, well, that's your problem. But in this case, it is a frustration that was clearly shared by previous administrations, Obama, Bush, and others. It is legitimately not just a hard target in North Korea, but a hard problem. And so the question is, what can the US and its allies do, short of actual warfare, to induce changes in the North Korean regime's behavior, particularly through economic diplomacy? And Haggard and Noland provide a unique insight. They state it is the case of North Korea on the title, and I want to emphasize that. This is an academic book of research that will stand the test of time in the whole literature that our colleagues have written on in sanctions for many years. But it is importantly about the most pressing case of dealing with an authoritarian regime that the US and our East Asian allies, and particularly South Korea, face right now. So please let me turn over to my friend and colleague, Marcus Noland.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming out this afternoon, and thanks to whoever watches this on the webcast live or on tape delay. As Adam mentioned, the work that I will be discussing this afternoon has been done jointly with Steph Haggard. Unfortunately, Steph could not be here this afternoon. I believe that Steph is at 38,000 feet somewhere. I don't know exactly where, but I think he's at 38,000 feet at the moment. We would like to thank the Smith-Richardson Foundation, which supported the survey work that underpins this book, and the Peterson Institute for supporting this launch event. What I would like to do this afternoon is talk a bit about sanctions and engagement in theory and in practice as applied to the North Korean state case, motivated by that country's nuclear weapons and missile programs. The conclusions are straightforward. Due to its internal political economy, North Korea is remarkably insensitive to either sanctions or inducements, while the outside world has limited influence on the policies that Pyongyang pursues. To the extent that outside actors can affect outcomes, South Korea is key. And due to recent political changes, both here in Washington and in Seoul, tail risks, both positive and negative, are rising. So how do we reach these conclusions? So let's first consider the case of economic sanctions. As we know from the magisterial work of our colleagues Jeff Schott, Gary Huffbauer, and I see that Kim Elliott is somewhere in the audience today, and other collaborators, we know that sanctions can work when the target country is small and weak. The behavior or action that the sanctions seek to change is not a core political goal of the targeted regime, and the coalition imposing the sanction is universal or near universal. But the nature of the target state is relevant as well. Authoritarian states, of which North Korea is an extreme example, can frustrate sanctions either by repressing the domestic political discontent associated with the imposition of sanctions, and by channeling sanctions-related rents to key constituencies and supporters. In the case of North Korea, it's under both UN and bilateral sanctions. The UN sanctions are mostly what I would call defensive in nature, seeking to disrupt North Korean military programs. In addition, there are limited luxury good sanctions aimed at punishing the elite. But these sanctions have been, at least the luxury good sanctions, have been ineffective, as shown in that chart, which applies luxury good sanctions lists of Japan and Australia to Chinese customs data. And as you can see, Chinese exports of luxury goods, as defined by these other third countries, have been rising steadily despite various UN Security Council resolutions. There is some evidence in the public record of success in disrupting trade in military goods, however, and these are detailed in the book. But targets do not remain static, and there is evidence that North Korea has both adapted the military programs to the sanctions environment, as well as shifting trade towards relatively lax sanctions implementing trade partners and financial centers. And as a consequence, there is no macroeconomic, there's no evidence of macroeconomic destabilization, as seen in the black market exchange rate data, which is in the blue on that chart. As you can see, it's relatively stable, as well as the price of rice. And nor is there evidence of increased risk premium on trade in non-sanctions items, as more sophisticated econometric analysis reported in the book shows. Perhaps it's this apparent lack of success which has contributed to sanctions fatigue, evident in the steadily lengthening times between North Korean nuclear tests and UN Security Council resolutions in response, as seen by that bar chart. After the first nuclear test, it took the UN Security Council 5 days to sanction North Korea. The last test, it took 82 days. And as you can see, it's steadily rising. In short, the latest rounds of sanctions may bite a bit more, but they're not enough alone to stop the North Korean missile or nuclear program. So if not sanctions, how about engagement? A surprising number of observers make the analytical mistake of leaping from the conclusion that if sanctions have been ineffective, then engagement must be the answer. Such considerations are particularly salient with respect to dismantling lumpy fixed investments in the nuclear, Such considerations are particularly salient because of a page that's missing in my notes, because of the changing government in Seoul, which is likely to adopt a much more forward stance with respect to engagement. Now, the problem is we can broadly think of engagement strategies as taking two broad conceptions. One is quid pro quo inducements, in which you effectively just pay the target country to alter their policy or behavior. And the second one is the long-run transformational aspects of engagement, where you actually try to change the nature of the target state itself. And both of these are evident in the rest of the world's dealings with North Korea. In the case of inducements, the basic problems are of sequencing and coordination, much like the case of sanctions. The issue is whether basically you pay the target up front and then expect the behavior, which creates moral hazard issues, or if you expect the behavior to change and then you will reward, and that leads to credibility issues. And you see this, and it's detailed in the book, in the case of the history of North Korea. And in terms of that history, the policies undertaken by the Roh Moo-hyun government in South Korea could be described as an appeasement policy, in which they were basically paying the North Koreans to buy peaceful coexistence while they focused on what they considered more important domestic policy issues. But there's also a history of attempts at a more instrumental policy of transformation. And the idea is that by engaging with the target state, you alter the internal coalitions within that state and thus reduce bellicosity in external relations. This idea goes all the way back to the liberal peace idea of the 19th century. In more modern times, you see that in Nixon's policy of détente towards the Soviet Union, Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik policy towards East Germany, and in fact, in another South Korean president, President Kim Dae-jung's policy, Sunshine Policy. It's worth recalling that the Sunshine Policy itself derives its name from the Aesop fable of the sun and the wind, in which the sun and the wind make a bet about which can induce a traveler to disrobe. The wind tries to blow, the traveler just pulls up his coat. The sun warms up the traveler, and the traveler voluntarily disrobes. So it is an instrumental policy aimed at transformation. Again, in the case of the problem with that policy is that the target is its basic endogeneity. The target country, if it is adverse to opening and reform, understands the Trojan horse or poison pill nature of the policy and will seek to undermine it. And it can do that by channeling that engagement through mechanisms that are controlled by the state, so that the process of engagement, rather than transforming the target, actually acts to reinforce the target. And we see this in the case of North Korea. North Korea, the government rests on relatively narrow constituencies. So if you look at the upper panel, and in some ways, the thing with these charts I'm showing, you don't actually need to be able to read the labels. You just need to be able to see colors. And as long as you're not colorblind, I think it works. So in this case, the upper panel, you have the Politburo membership by career affiliation. And what you see is that upper line, the blue lines, is increasing. And that is members of the Politburo who come from military backgrounds. And they are essentially squeezing out other groups. Economists are the purple ones, the second from the bottom. And as you can see, economists in particular are getting squeezed out. So it is a regime that rests on rather narrow basis, and in particularly a militarized one. When you get to, and so the nature of the economy, the political economy is important. And again, you face the same international coordination problems. And the book goes into some detail on this, that just as in the sanctions case, defections from the sanction coalition can undermine the effectiveness of sanctions, international coordination on the proffers of engagement can also undermine those effects as well. So when we get to the specifics of the North Korean case, we see that there are a couple things that are worth taking into account. First of all, the marketization of the economy, in which we observed over the last 25 years, is a product of state failure. It's not a product of top-down reform, and as a consequence, the state has always had an ambivalent stance towards the market and the development of economy that it doesn't control. Secondly, as I mentioned, it has these narrow constituencies with increased role of the military. It seeks to corral exchange. We detail in this book, based on the surveys we did of Chinese and South Korean firms doing business in North Korea. And an example of that is shown in the second panel. Second panel shows three bars. The first, and it's derived from our survey of Chinese businesses doing business in North Korea. The first panel is Chinese exporters. And it's asking them who their counterparties are. And as you can see, there's lots of different colors on that chart, right? The specifics almost don't matter. It's just there's lots of variation. When we ask the Chinese, who are your counterparties on the import side, much less variation. State-owned enterprises, which is the blue bar, takes a much bigger part. Then when we ask Chinese enterprises who were investing in North Korea, who your joint venture partners were, because the North Koreans were not allowing standalone investments, you're now down to the three core institutions of the state: the SOEs, the government itself, and the military. So the degree of involvement of the economy, the state works to make sure that it is channeled to mechanisms that it can control. And in the book, we go into a fair amount of detail how the state has actively tried to squash the kind of decentralized trade with China that has developed over the last 20 years and channel it through these mechanisms that the state controls. The last point is that in the transformational model, modalities matter. And they matter to both them and to us. They matter to us because we're trying to transform them so they are less bellicose. It matters to them because they are trying to resist that transformation. So from the standpoint of the North Koreans, if you look at the ways that currently the world engages with them economically, at the top of the list is straight cash payments through aid or some other mechanism. Second one is overflight rights. Airplane flies above North Korea, 38,000 feet. Nobody notices it. The money goes straight to the North Korean treasury. Third best is pipelines and railroads. You put the pipeline under the country, you put the railroad tracks down, the railroad train rolls down the tracks, you make money, but nobody actually interacts with anybody on the railroad. The fourth best is enclaves, such as the Kaesong Industrial Complex and the Mount Kumgang Tourism Complex. And the worst form of engagement from the North Korean standpoint is decentralized exchange, such as is exhibited in many of its dealings with China. And as I indicated, the state actually tries actively to channel that and limit the effects of transformation. So the bottom line is that marketization and opening from a North Korean standpoint may complicate governance, but it is not necessarily politically destabilizing, and indeed it actually may generate resources that reinforce state power. In particular, North Korea has revived the doctrine of Byungjin Line, which is parallel movements across two tracks, in this case the development of nuclear weapons and the development of the economy. And this is really critical because this doctrine posits a complementarity, not a conflict, between nuclear weapons and economic development. And in particular, it does not signal that economic reform implies a moderation of external behavior, but rather it signals a continuation of external tensions. There we go. Yes, in front of American audiences, this slide often gets chuckles. For these reasons, the relative insularity and insensitivity to external stimulus, whether it be in the form of sanctions or whether it be in forms of inducement, the preferences and capabilities of the North Korean leadership are key. And honestly, if you remember anything from today's talk, remember this slide. It's the most important thing I'm going to show you. A few years ago, Kim Jong-un, leader of North Korea, faced an interesting choice. The fellow in the red scarf here on the left-hand panel, that's Eric Schmidt, the chair of Google, one of the world's most dynamic and innovative companies. When Schmidt came to Pyongyang, Kim did not have time to meet with him. Instead, he sent him to what appears to be a unheated room to watch a North Korean soldier who appears to be dressed in a quilted jacket type at a keyboard. Yet, 6 times, Kim found days on his schedule to confer with the noted American diplomat Dennis Rodman. That simple choice, given the opportunity to confer with Eric Schmidt or given the opportunity to party with Dennis Rodman, and that choice reveals something about Kim's values, priorities, and quite frankly, to me, his suitability for leadership. And as much as the complexities of the economic and diplomatic relations addressed in the book, this choice is suggestive of how decision-making in authoritarian regimes is subject not only to the institutional and economic constraints that we elaborate, but to the discretion and even, frankly, the whim of its leadership. So where does that lead us? North Korea is the paradigmatic hard target. It is insensitive to either sanctions or engagement. The outside world should have modest expectations about our ability to influence North Korea. Specifically, the country's future is largely going to be determined by the preferences and abilities of its leadership. But to the extent that the outside world can influence outcomes in North Korea, South Korea is key. Seoul has a new government, which is adopting a more forward-leaning engagement policy relative to its predecessors. Whether it will look more like the inducement policy of Roh Moo-hyun or the transformative policy of Kim Dae-jung remains to be seen. Beijing will not take a harder line than Seoul. And coordination failure could create a highly dangerous situation. Just when the United States and China may be acting in concert to strengthen sanctions, a non-conditional policy, North-South engagement policy could effectively throw North Korea a lifeline and could allow Pyongyang to resolve the contradiction embodied in the Beijing line. The enablement of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs could bring the country closer to eventual military conflict with the United States, which would be horrific for both the northern and southern halves of the peninsula. Yet the likelihood of peaceful resolution of the North Korea problem could be rising as well. When confronted with the paucity of good military options on the Korean peninsula, US policymakers will be forced to re-examine options for resolving the issue diplomatically. Historically, Republicans in the US Congress have used North Korea as a political cudgel to assault Democratic political presidents, most notably Bill Clinton. I suspect that this political history is one of the reasons that the Obama administration adopted the so-called policy of strategic patience. Today, we have a unified government under Republican administration. I've always thought that it would require this political alignment or configuration to resolve the North Korean issue diplomatically, much like it required the arch anti-communist Richard Nixon to establish diplomatic relations between the United States and China. Moreover, deal-making is central to the self-conception of President Donald Trump, who indeed spoke during his campaign of his willingness to negotiate directly with Kim Jong-un over the nuclear issue, indeed negotiate with Kim Jong-un directly over the nuclear issue over a hamburger and Coke, and has more recently reaffirmed his willingness under the right conditions. A kind of second-best equilibrium solution is not hard to sketch out. As part of the final resolution of the Korean War, the US and DPRK established diplomatic relations and signed a peace treaty formally ending the war. As part of that package, the signatories recognize that on multiple occasions, North and South Korea have committed to a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula. That commitment defines the end state. But the parties recognize that in the medium run, the existing North Korean nuclear program poses a legacy issue. Thereby, North Korea agrees to no new development, no new production, no new testing, and critically, no proliferation beyond North Korea. During this medium-run period, the Koreas worked to achieve the final end state of a nuclear-free peninsula, while the United States, China, and others provide North Korea and South Korea with various security guarantees and economic incentives to facilitate this process. The second-best solution is not optimal, but it's something we could live with. It is conceivable that the conditions are aligned for an eventual Nixon goes to China moment. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Marcus, and thank you for reminding us of your extensive trove of Dennis Rodman memorabilia. We have today with us, reflecting the stature in which your and Steph's work is held, some of the leading experts and policy influencers on Korean issues in Washington. And I will shortly turn it over to them for discussion on the critical issue. But as I tried to say in the introduction, and I know you feel, your work, this book with Steph, isn't just about North Korea. It is about the general issue of sanctions. And so I was wondering, before we turn back to the Korean issue, if you could say a few words about what the implications of your research are for other somewhat, but perhaps not so extreme authoritarian regimes like Russia or Iran in US sanctions policy.
Sure. So I think that the basic lesson of the book is to argue that both sanctions and almost symmetrically engagement face issues with regard to sequencing and international coordination, but also the nature of the target state. And so, for example, in the case of Iran, which we discuss briefly in the book, one of the differences between Iran and North Korea was the nature of the Iranian economy allowed a focus on the oil sector, which was imperfect, but it did allow a kind of degradation of the Iranian economy. And given the relatively less authoritarian nature of Iran compared to North Korea, the Iranian government did have to respond to popular discontent. So a sanctions policy towards Iran, both in some sense was more effective in a narrow sense of affecting the economy, but more importantly, it had the desired political response on the part of the Iranian state because of the nature of Iran's internal political economy. And I guess we should take this moment to send our condolences to the people of Iran. Despite all the political differences we have, what happened there today was terrible. And it simply shows that no country is immune to this kind of barbarism.
And that non-state actors remain a threat, even as we talk about trying to affect state actors, of course.
Right.
Thank you very much, Mark. Let me open it up to our distinguished audience. As usual, we will have a traveling mic in front in Jessica's hand. There's a standing mic in back. Those of you towards the back can go in line there. Please, when recognized, state your name and affiliation. Yeah, could you go to the mic in back, please? You can go first, but if you go to the mic in back, it'll make our life easier.
Okay, I'm Joshua Stanton of the One Free Korea blog. Good to see you again, Marcus.
I like your tie.
Thank you very much. Thanks for sending the memo. So I'm disadvantaged by not having read your book, so I don't know your analysis in detail. If I understand the first conclusion that you made about sanctions, I understood it to be a little different than the way you summarized it. The way I understood it is that sanctions as implemented over, let's say, since 2006, when the UN passed its first Chapter 7 resolution, is that sanctions like that, as implemented, have not worked and are not likely to work. Is that a fair statement of what you actually concluded in your book?
The phrase "not worked" is particularly important. So one can document that the imposition of sanctions has at times affected the North Korean economy. It has not worked in the sense of achieving the desired political goal of halting the North Korean nuclear program or the missile program, and I do not believe that sanctions alone will do that. Those sanctions is almost surely part of a broader political process to achieve that goal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as part of that broader political process, then you're saying that the end state is some kind of a diplomatic agreement. An agreement, I would add, that North Korea has repeatedly said it is not interested in, does not want, will not accept to freeze or limit its nuclear program in any way whatsoever. How do you propose to get to that end state then if, in fact, the assumption is that all sanctions broadly, as implemented or perhaps implemented in a different way, can't really be effective in influencing the regime? I mean, we're talking about a government that has directly threatened the United States, Japan, and South Korea, built a nuclear reactor in a part of Syria controlled by ISIS, cyber attacked the United States, and taken a very big bite out of our own freedom of expression here. I mean,
cheated on past agreements.
Yeah, we're willing to stipulate to all that. Can you pose a question, please?
What causes you to think that we're going to get to a diplomatic agreement with a state that doesn't respect boundaries or standards or obligations?
That's a completely fair question. And the way that I would answer that is to say that I think that we need a combination of increased pressure. Tightening sanctions is part of that package. And you have, in your own writings, have detailed all the ways that we could increase pressure. And so I think increasing pressure is part of that process.
And is that in your book?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But then you have to offer an alternative to simply increasing pressure. And whether at the end of the day, North Korea would be willing, under those circumstances, to accept the package that I sketch out or not is an open question. They may reject that, no matter, I mean, you know, and then we really get into highly hypothetical situations. I mean, depending on look, right now, China accounts for more than 90% of their trade. Key commodity is oil. They're also the marginal supplier of grain. If China were to cut them off, this place would be in economic, implosion very rapidly. I don't expect China to do that. But but your response to that political offer is conditional on the environment you face. And if you face a more challenging environment, you may get to a different answer than you would have gotten to 10 or 15 years ago. At the end of the day, they may reject that. I mean, it may be that there is not a plausible set of inducements and agreements that can be put on the table that will satisfy them. At that point, we are looking at potentially a military response. But I think that one has to try. And so I would say that let's increase pressure, but let's at the same time offer them a way out. And hopefully they'll take that way out. Maybe they won't. And if they don't, then obviously Northeast Asia is in a very bad position.
Thank you. Next question, please. Jessica, could you go to that gentleman there? Or he's going to the mic. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Don Kirk. You introduced one term which I really should know more about, namely Byungjin. You said that that's sort of related nuclear to economic power and all that. I thought that term went back quite far. I thought there was a whole history of that term with which maybe you could enlighten us, since I don't know enough about it, and I'd appreciate whatever you can tell us about Byungjin. Thank you.
I'm a little embarrassed because there are far more erudite Korea scholars in the room. But the Byungjin line, as I recall, was originally introduced by Kim Il-sung. The date is in the book, which specific year, around 1962, I think. And it was the development of both military capacity and, at that time, the industry. So when it was revived by Kim Jong-un a few years ago, some people took the signal that they were reviving it as economic development, not just the production of heavy industry, as being some kind of sign of greater liberalism. Rudiger Frank made that argument. But I think the argument that we make repeatedly in the book is that you can't overlook the fact that this doctrine, or what they're calling a doctrine, involves what we regard as a fundamental contradiction. That you can hang out a shingle saying open for business while you're threatening the world's largest market with nuclear weapons and cyber attacks and everything else that Josh just elucidated. And indeed, I think many of us probably interpret the Byungjin line less as a strategic doctrine, as a internal political compromise to just paper over the fact that you do, even within a regime as authoritarian and personalist as North Korea, you do have different tendencies within the North Korean state. I mean, the military obviously wants ever more resources, ever more weapons. There are elements, I think, probably of the party and the state that would like to see resources channeled in a somewhat different direction. And so if you're a young, untested leader, what better than a doctrine that says we're going to do both? You're going to satisfy both of these constituencies in the state that you're sitting on top of. So that's basically my quick, my potted history of the line.
Great, thank you. That gentleman there, please.
Michael Marshall, Global Peace Foundation. In connection with your remarks about the DPRK's attempts to, I think the term used was to corral all the different forms of economic exchange, does your book go into the impact of official corruption or corruption among officialdom on that broad process of the state trying to control? And if so, what are your conclusions on that?
Thank you very much for that question. In trying to summarize a 300-page book in 20 minutes, I left out a lot of detail, and in fact, some of the detail and methodology that I'm most proud of. So one of the things Steph and I did in this book, and as far as I know, this is completely unique and has not been done by anyone else, is we actually did surveys, large-scale surveys of Chinese businesses and South Korean businesses. And we even had control groups who did not go into the DPRK to compare to those who did. And one of the themes that comes out, and it's consistent with work that we obtained from refugee surveys that appeared in a book that Adam mentioned in his introduction, Witness to Transformation, is that there are high levels of corruption, indeed possibly even rising levels of corruption. The basic issue, and it's also, it sort of is reflected in that bar chart I had of the exporters, importers, and investors. So basically what happens is, and it's particularly important for Chinese businesses, they look at North Korea, and this is a business environment that is extraordinarily weak. The last time I looked, it was literally tied for last place, 176th place in the Transparency International rankings. It was tied with Somalia. Okay, it's an extraordinarily challenging business environment in which property rights are not respected, rules and regulations are changed capriciously. You know, any serious kind of formal dispute resolution mechanisms do not exist, so on. So if you are going to do business in that environment, you either you have to develop ways of trying to resolve things in an informal way, and that is generally appeals to political pressure, bribery, and some kind of network response where you have networks of, say, Chinese businesses, and if you screw one of us, we all react. And you see this in our survey data. The Chinese regard the place as extraordinarily corrupt. They were pretty straightforward about how much bribes they pay and so on. And there are issues, and what you see that as well is that facing that corruption, it has two specific implications for sort of the terms on which North Korea globalizes. The first is that the Chinese are afraid of investment and because they fear expropriation. So firms engage in trading activities rather than having any kind of physical presence in North Korea. Secondly, you see it in the financial terms. With the exception of a dyad, which consists of large Chinese state-owned enterprises and in business with large North Korean state-owned enterprises, some of those relationships extending back 25 years or more, you see virtually no evidence of any kind of trust or credit. Financial relations, and this is an exaggeration, but financial relations are basically cash on the barrelhead. So when you put those two things together, lack of investment and lack of trust manifested in these very tight financial terms, the way that the trade ends up working is you have politically sanctioned entities in North Korea physically going into China, literally with kind of the proverbial suitcases full of money, purchasing Chinese consumer goods and bringing them back into North Korea for sale. That modality then has actually interesting political implications because those consumer goods are largely sold in Pyongyang. That's where the money is. That's where the consumers are. And it goes down a supply chain that goes down the western coast of the country. We may think of China as a repressive place, but compared to North Korea, it is information nirvana. Now, somebody can contradict me, I may be wrong, but I do not believe that KCNA, the official North Korean press agency, ever reported the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak, certainly never described the way that Muammar Gaddafi met his end, and so on. The people who are going into China physically to make those purchases are exposed to all this news and information. And so that supply chain brings down to Pyongyang not only color television sets and ladies' dresses, but it also brings down information about political developments abroad. And that is one of the reasons why the state regards the market with such ambivalence. The market is not only a mechanism that's not under complete state control for wealth and prestige and potentially ability to challenge politically, but it is a kind of semi-autonomous zone of social communication. So I didn't go into this in the interest of time, but the book goes into this in quite a bit about how the very specific nature of this political economy constrains the way the state operates and constrains the way the state structures both the economy internally and very critically, its external economic relations, and hence the effectiveness of sanctions and inducements.
Mark, let me follow up on that excellent question with something else that I think you didn't quite get a chance to do justice to in your initial presentation, which is the idea that some forms of sanctions are providing rents to some of the leadership in Pyongyang? I mean, is there something there you want to expand on, because you've mentioned that in other contexts?
Sure.
Or some inducements as well, not just sanctions.
Well, so in my answer just now, I focused mainly on China. We also did a survey of South Korea, and South Korea is, in some ways, you see similar responses in the surveys, but in some ways the survey responses are very different. And the key difference is that until everything got shut down because of bilateral sanctions, most South Korean exchange with North Korea went through the Kaesong industrial complex. And for all intents and purposes, Kaesong is a South Korean island inside of North Korea with cheap labor. The institutional rules, the legal mechanisms, the finance is all South Korean. And so basically, and partly this is because the North Koreans have held South Korean firms under even tighter control than Chinese firms. And so essentially, you have in North Korea, Chinese firms, the firms and enterprises from the communist country are behaving like, profit-seeking capitalists. And the firms and enterprises from the capitalist country are behaving like the socialist tools of foreign policy. I mean, they're going into this enclave with a lot of state support. And that state support goes directly to the government Pyongyang. And indeed, I believe that under, and it's too bad Josh just left, but I believe that Kaesong, as it was operating in the past, would be in violation of UN Resolution 2321. And so the South Korean government is talking about reopening it. I expect, unless, theoretically you could operate it in a way that conforms to that UN resolution, but I think that's extremely unlikely. So a move to reopen that by the South Korean government, I think, is going to bring the South Korean government into conflict with the United States and others as basically busting out of the sanctions regime.
Thank you. Another question. The gentleman in back raising your hand.
Thank you, Marcus. I think.
I'm sorry, could you identify yourself?
My name is Mutai Alagapo. I'm a non-resident with Carnegie Endowment.
Thank you.
Okay. And my question relates to what is really the North Korea problem. We all seem to talk as though we understand what the North Korea problem is. And you talked of resolution in one of your slides. And you also talked about the possibility of resolution rising. So I was hoping you can kindly illuminate what is the North Korean problem, and why do you think the prospects of resolution are rising? Thank you.
Well, yeah, so at the outset, I basically said this discussion is framed in the context of its nuclear weapons program, missiles program. I mean, that's why we're concerned about sanctions and inducements. And the reason that nuclear weapons and missiles are a problem is that the development of those programs could eventually allow North Korea to get to a position in which it believed that it had a fairly free hand to bully South Korea and Japan, and that those countries, looking at North Korea's ability to strike the United States with nuclear weapons and having second strike capability, would believe that the US policy of extended deterrence and a nuclear umbrella were ineffective, and that they would be driven to develop their own independent nuclear capacity. So in short, we are on a trajectory towards a situation in which you would have a nuclear arms race in Northeast Asia involving rich technologically advanced countries, as well as a hostile state that regularly makes threats against the United States with nuclear weapons and the capacity to hit the United States. So most people would consider that a problem.
And in generic intellectual terms, the problem is we have the following diplomatic goal, how do we use sanctions and inducements to move it? So it's not an existential problem of North Korea in some ideological sense. The gentleman right here, please, Jessica, and then in back.
Thank you. My name is Wong Kyung Kim. I'm associated with Samsung America. I think the officials at Trump White House will be very disappointed if they read your book, especially the part that you said China is not going to take a harder line than Seoul. They have such high expectations about what China can do. And I think it's a popular assumption in the world that the sanctions policy have not worked so far because China really did not implement the sanctions, although China have been taking some actions, but they have not done key actions which can really force North Korea to change. And also it's a popular assumption that there are so much still that China can do, which can make the sanctions more effective and potentially change the course of action that North Korea can take in the future. And the sanctions may include political sanctions as well, not just economic sanctions, but political sanctions that China can take to change the course of action that North Korea can take. So if your statement is about China is not going to do all of those, despite the potential deal that they can cut with the Trump administration, then it's really devastating for the Trump administration. So the question, I guess, for you is, do you believe that if, as the popular assumption says, China really decides to impose sanctions, there are much more that they can do and change the course of action that North Korea can take?
Well, under the current circumstance, which reflects the fact that South Korea basically does not have economic relations with North Korea, which is likely to change. But under the current circumstance, China accounts for more than 90% of recorded trade. It basically is North Korea's oil supplier. It's North Korea's grain supplier. It has, I would challenge you to identify any other pairing of countries in the world where there is that degree of dependence, okay? China has, today at least, has extreme leverage on North Korea, which it does not use. It does not use, when you talk to Chinese, they give you a variety of explanations why. But the revealed preference is that China would rather have a nuclear North Korea threatening its neighbors than political instability in North Korea that could result in all sorts of outcomes, including unification under Seoul. And so China has been reluctant to exercise the leverage that I believe it clearly has. I think that is a very risky game, because the current trajectory points towards a military confrontation between the United States and North Korea. So I have always urged my Chinese colleagues to act with greater diligence in terms of encouraging North Korea to reach a settlement. And I think part of it, and again, as I said to Josh, it is a two-part process. You've got to put enough pressure on them to bring them to the table, but then when you get to the table, you have to negotiate sincerely. And there may be a deal to be had. I sketched out an outlines of what I think that deal would look like. It is no guarantee that the North Koreans would be willing to accept that deal. And in that case, I think we are in a very, very dangerous situation.
Mr. Kim, I very much appreciate your reality check on this. And I know there are people in this audience and watching online and people who read Mark and Steph's work, as well as you and your network, who have some influence on the degree to which the national security parts of the Trump administration do listen to experts. And while I share your concern that this may lead to the results of their research would lead to some disappointment, I think it would be wise for some of our friends in this audience to try to convey directly to the responsible parties in the Trump administration not to get the president and others' hopes up unduly about what China can do, at least in the short term, because obviously disappointments and frustrations in that relationship would have terrible implications potentially more broadly. So you're absolutely right to underline the point.
I actually am amused. I thought this book will actually disappoint the new Moon administration in Seoul even more than the Trump administration. But
one hopes they're more likely to take advice, but who knows? At the back, please, and then the lady there.
Thanks, Jeremy Zettelmeyer, PIE. So this is a question about engagement. So you argued, I think very persuasively, that if you have a regime that's paranoid about resisting any sort of transformation, obviously transformation-focused engagement will not work. But there's also a form of engagement, I think you refer to it in passing, that is more like, if you like, sort of incentives-friendly appeasement. So it's not about destabilizing the regime, it's not about transformative change, it's just about improving behavior. And so you give up, for example, on the nuclear program, all you want is for them to behave as responsible with their nuclear weapons as, for example, China. And the way you do it, in principle, is by sending a big check to the leadership every year, and if they behave irresponsibly, you cut the check, or equivalently, you could have all these grains and energy imports routed through South Korea, and so they would lose interest in attacking South Korea. So can you comment on that?
sure. So first of all, Neville Chamberlain gave appeasement a bad name. There are circumstances in which appeasement is a completely advisable, legitimate policy response. I can name a couple circumstances in which that's probably your best option, and it's not a bad thing to do. The problem in the case of North Korea is that for all the reasons that Josh Stanton was going into at the outset, it's very hard to make a deal stick with them. And we go through examples in the book of highly legalistic interpretations of things and so on. So if, for example, you're the South Korean government under Roh Moo-hyun, you're basically paying the North Koreans just to kind of be quiet, or in better words, peaceful coexistence, because you're really focused on social engineering within South Korea. The problem is what peaceful coexistence may look like from Seoul, or at least from that government, may not be okay with Japan or the United States. Where, and again, I mean, to be a bit pejorative, if the deal was, we pay you as long as the nuclear weapons point at somebody else. I mean, you can see why that sort of doesn't work. And so you add into these, variety of preferences and variety of policy goals across the actors, these basic coordination problems. I am very skeptical that an appeasement policy towards North Korea as it's constituted today would lead to acceptable outcomes. But I want to make clear, in theory at least, there are times and places where appeasement is actually the right thing to do.
In a sense, though, the spirit of your hard target is to say it's not so much Neville Chamberlain who gave appeasement a bad name, it's Adolf Hitler who gave appeasement a bad name.
Yeah.
But anyway, but your point is well taken. I'm sorry, the lady there with the mic.
Roberta Cohen, Coalition of Independent Scholars. Marcus, I wonder if you could comment on any findings with regard to the humanitarian implications of sanctions, whether you feel that the sanctions has produced the kind of impact that humanitarian organizations or the Secretary General of the UN will bring to light, or whether this is exaggerated. Is the humanitarian side of the equation one of the casualties of the sanctions and the increasing sanctions and tightening of the sanctions, and what impact does that have within North Korea?
So I'm glad you asked that question, because one of the things in my notes on the page that didn't make it down to the first floor was a reference to a chapter in the book. We have an entire chapter devoted to humanitarian issues. And the point that we make is not the point that you're asking about. The point that we made in the book is that aid was often used as the quid pro quo, as an inducement policy. We have a large chart. It started in Avoiding the Apocalypse, and we just keep on adding examples of food for talks. That we would, to get the North Koreans to come to the table, we would give them another dollop of food aid. So aid has clearly been used, despite all the denials. Aid has clearly been used in that instrumental sense. Now, to address your question, food insecurity in North Korea is chronic, and quite frankly, North Korean government doesn't really seem to care all that much about it. And to the extent that most food is produced, that's consumed in North Korea, is produced within North Korea, considering the state has various mechanisms to channel food to disadvantaged groups if it chose to do so, I think that sanctions as currently constituted, most of which aim at the military. There's some that aim at luxury goods, and then there are some bilateral sanctions that are broader, affecting all commercial trade. I think that it's difficult to argue that those sanctions have had a decisive effect on food security within, or food insecurity within North Korea. Certainly they haven't helped, but I think that the fundamental drivers of food insecurity in North Korea are things other than the sanctions regime that the country faces.
Great, thank you. The gentleman at the back mic.
Dan, I'm with the National Bureau of Asian Research. Thanks, Marcus. Look forward to reading the book. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the implications for the informal market within Korea, within North Korea. You did mention that the flow of information creates this information space within the market. So the two sub-questions are, one, how does this informal market play out? Is there an end state, and what does that look like? And then question number two would be, how does North Korea respond to this? At some point, do they try to scale back like they did with the currency reforms and other examples? And how would that look like?
So I don't mean to pick on you. But I would, but I would challenge. No, I would challenge because I think it reflects kind of how North Korea has changed over the years. I mean, a lot of people say North Korea is unchanging. No, North Korea changes a lot. Those markets really aren't informal anymore. The state has built hundreds of physical structures in which people have a legal right to go buy and sell. I was on the telephone with Curtis Melvin yesterday, and he told me he found 3 more looking at his satellite photographs, right? So that structure is not so informal anymore. I mean, there are informal activities and there are illegal activities. And there's a lot of activity that goes on that's technically illegal. And that kind of gets to your question, which is, where does this go? So I said that North Korea is not unchanging. Kim Jong-un differs from his father and his grandfather in that Kim Jong-un is clearly more comfortable with bling. Kim Jong-un is clearly more comfortable with a degree of obvious social differentiation based on wealth and ostentatious consumption than either his father or his grandfather were. So I think that kind of sets a baseline that there's probably no going back to the 1970s, right? And everybody wearing, Mao jackets or something. That said, the state has always been kind of ambivalent about this process, and I believe that is the reason why they have kept on the books the legal prohibitions against many activities that currently exist, because that gives them the ability to control this emerging class of nouveau riche, because the activities that they are engaged in, while they're tolerated, and indeed, oftentimes they are in business with state entities, is technically illegal. And that allows them, if politics change or if you just get crossways with somebody, to be punished. That's one of the reasons why we have a fairly steady stream of fairly wealthy individuals fleeing into China, because something started to go wrong and they took their money and ran. So I think that it is part of, in one of the slides I said this complicates governance, but is not necessarily destabilizing. It is something that on some level Kim Jong-un seems comfortable with, but at the same time has kept in place the mechanisms that allow them to control or even to some extent turn back the clock. I think that is the best way of characterizing this. I would say that the North Korean economy today is increasingly centered on the extraction of natural resources, primarily mineral resources, but some other natural resources as well. And if you put those two things together, a kind of tolerance for, social differentiation based on wealth, and what is an economy that is increasingly resource extractive centric, you get to a position that I described in another book with my colleague Colin Henderson. Hendricks, excuse me. Thank you. Where you get rentier states, where the economy generates a lot of resources for the leader and a small group around him, and the rest of the country is basically, in a fairly bad situation, kind of left to fend for themselves. And so if you say, where is this going? I would say the trajectory is to a kind of political economy that would be familiar to people who look at sub-Saharan Africa or Central Asia, except with nuclear weapons.
But Mark, just quick follow-up on that. Given the work you and Colin Hendricks have done on those sorts of things, is that if we get to that state, that regime, that kind of situation in North Korea, does that then become more susceptible to either sanctions or inducements on the economic side than the current, or does that not change it?
That's a great question. I think it ultimately could make them more vulnerable because you would have increasing levels of wealth and you would have people who had stakes in particular forms of exchange, that if you could impinge on those forms of exchange, you might have some internal political economy effects. But I would also just add that in the case of what we're interested in particular the nuclear weapons program, even in a state as authoritarian as North Korea, there are what political scientists call audience costs. And the process of the famine was called the arduous march. And if you tell people they went through the arduous march to achieve this, and you are literally putting nuclear weapons and missiles up on billboards and on postage stamps, to then kind of negotiate them away is a hard thing. Maybe we get a freeze, maybe that is portrayed internally in a certain way. But even in a state where there's more of a market economy, more money is going into this elite, to give up that core political achievement, I think, is very difficult.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end of our time, so I'm going to consolidate the last two questions. The gentleman here and then at the back mic.
Yes, Alexander Mansurov from Georgetown. Marcus, fantastic book. Thank you so much for putting it out. I'll use it as a required reading in one of my courses at Georgetown. An observation and a question. The devil is in the details as we know it. If I were a North Korean looking at the latest sanctions resolution, what would I say? I'd say, okay, 95% of my oil comes from China, and yet Americans and the United States sanctions Russian oil companies, which basically sell less than 0.5% of my oil products to me. So it's not about me, it's about US-Russia, squabble, whatever it is. Because if they wanted to hurt my oil sector, they would go after the Chinese oil suppliers, not the Russian. If you look at the individuals, a few of them are in the mid-90s, barely moving, very far away from any decision-making process, whether it's Paek Se-bon or Ri Yong-mu or what have you. A few of them are low-level functionaries, easily replaceable. The guys burned in the field, so they can replace them easily. So again, the impression there is that the Americans, the international community, are not really serious about getting the real decision makers there too. So when we talk about the efficacy of sanctions, really the devil is in the details, and the judgment of North Koreans says, you know what, they're not really serious. That's the observation. The question I have a simple one. If South Korea goes rogue, if you wish, if the Moon administration decides to implement its Sunshine 2.0 policy, what implications do you expect of that on the US-ROC alliance? I mean, do you expect the decoupling on the sanctions? I mean, you mentioned the busting of the sanctions. China obviously will go easy. Russia will follow China's suit. So what will it do to our overall strategy of dealing with North Korea?
Thank you. And please, at the back, Mike.
Robert Tompkin with Congressional Quarterly. Marcus, when you talk about Chinese fears of Korean unification, is it Chinese fears of Korea being unified or Chinese fears of Korea being unified with U.S. troops on the Yalu? And if that's the case, can you talk about any types of grand bargains that would lead to the U.S. withdrawing those troops? And secondly, given the experience of Germany with unification, how much trepidation is there that you've found in South Korea towards some type of unification and the economic costs involved?
Okay, so we're at the end of our allotted time, so I will try to be brief with those two gigantic questions at the end. Let me simply say this. The way that I got into the North Korea business was that I had the wonderful opportunity to be a visiting scholar at the Korea Development Institute in the early 1990s, shortly after German unification. And at that point, KDI was located in a very isolated part of town, and the only place to eat lunch was in the cafeteria. So at noon every day, they would ring a bell, and we would all go down to the cafeteria. And every day, I would sit with my colleagues, and we would discuss German unification. And the consensus view among the South Korean economists at that point, that the Germans screwed up the monetary conversion rate. We're not going to make that mistake. This is going to be a walk in the park. Obviously, attitudes have changed tremendously in the intervening 25 years. Now there is considerable trepidation, especially among younger people. They look at the demographics of South Korea. They look at how much of a social burden they are going to bear paying for their elders, and the last thing they want is 25 million cousins sticking out their hands. So there's an important issue within South Korea. In terms of China, look, I'm not Chinese, and I'm hesitant to speak for China, but I think that there are many people within China who regard the division of the Korean Peninsula as a good thing. You have a fraternally allied socialist state on your border. If you get unification, there is a fear that you will have American troops on the Yalu River. And no matter how many times you try to explain to the Chinese that, first of all, that's of little utility to the United States in the 21st century, that does seem to be their fear. And so you could imagine a situation which is part of some kind of grand bargain. There is either removal or confinement of American troops to a certain part of the peninsula. If there were unification, one of the things I've argued with the Chinese is, frankly, if I was attaching probability likelihoods, the probability that the American political system, not the elites in the room, looking at Doug Paul, but the American political system would respond, job well done, mission accomplished, pull them all home. That would be a higher likelihood than infantry sitting on the Yalu River. In terms of Sasha's questions, yes, this last sanctions resolution was a big nothing burger, but it was, so the glass is half full, glass is half empty. First of all, it was in response to a missile test, and usually they haven't done anything, so at least they did something. If there's another nuclear test, you may see a much more dramatic reaction. Secondly, what really matters is not what China is willing to allow to go through the UN Security Council, but what China may be doing under the radar privately. And there are stories about the oil and so on and so forth. In terms of the United States, I have been astonished by the degree to which Americans in Washington have not understood that the last 10 years was really easy for us, because we had political alignments in Washington and Seoul that had a pretty high level of fundamental kind of ideological overlap. Sort of to speak roughly, the most overlapping coalition is a Democrat in the White House and conservatives in the Blue House. There you get kind of an overlap. If you get a progressive in the Blue House, so I guess I should move my hand to the left, and Republican in the White House, that gap really opens up. And so I think the next 4 years could be a very interesting ride in terms of U.S.-Korea relations. I have a funny feeling we're going to be very nostalgic for the Lee Myung-bak, Park Geun-hye, Obama years.
At least on this particular issue.
On this issue.
Thank you so much, Marcus. As I think you've all seen, the depth and breadth of scholarship that went into this book, Hard Target, by Steph Haggard and Marcus Noland, but also the broader research that Marcus helms for us here at the Peterson Institute. I encourage you, the screen's up, but look at the North Korea blog for those of you who are not already aficionados. Look back at Mark's fantastic book, Avoiding the Apocalypse, and buy a copy of Hard Target. Thank you very much.